Alright, so Lee Zeldin just said that he is going to work to end the stop-start feature in your car. Now, on newer cars, you see it more and more where you get to a stoplight or something and you're sitting there for a second and the car turns off, and then you go and start moving and it turns back on. This was obviously done to help emissions and lower overall emissions, because when they test these cars, they don't just test them in like driving or wide open throttle. They test them over, say, like 2 days of use, of normal use, and they see how it is, and if they can bring it down by having the car turn off for, say, 2, 5, 8% of your commute, maybe if you're in stop and go traffic or at a drive-thru or something like that, then that brings overall emissions down. That is the hope. And honestly, it's a pretty decent way to overcome emissions regulations, because if you think about it, if they can do something like this fairly simply, that means that they don't have to compromise on something like amount of horsepower or torque or aerodynamics or something like that that helps overall pollution. And now, if they had to compromise on, say, the transmission or the engine or how much horsepower it makes, that would be more of a compromise that you would feel in your day-to-day driving, more than it being just turn off and turn on randomly, something that you can just turn off. Like, it's just a button right on the dash. I would prefer if it was in a normally off state versus a normally on state. Like, you get in the car and you start it up and you have to turn it off every time if you don't want it, or you just ignore it. And I've had tons of people comment saying they truly don't mind it, and it actually helps them, and it saves them some emissions, and it saves them some gas, so kind of a win-win. I always say, left to our own devices, car guys would build the most efficient vehicles possible that save the most gas possible, because gas is expensive, and especially if you just commute to work, you probably want the best gas mileage possible. And that's what most people, in my opinion, want. It's the reason the Prius is so popular. It's the reason EVs are fairly popular, but probably still not as popular as the Prius, because the Prius was without flaw. As like the first gen, second gen Prius, at least what came to the US, without flaw. But aside from my love of the Prius, so the tweet from Lee Zeldin, if you don't know, he is the head of the EPA. He said, "Stop-start technology, where your car dies at every red light so companies get a climate participation trophy. EPA approved it and everyone hates it, so we're fixing it." And like I said, if you take this away, the car companies will have to compromise elsewhere, because there is still this benchmark of you have to be this efficient. So if you don't move the benchmark, which I imagine this is like a prerequisite to moving the benchmark, but if you're not going to move the benchmark, this is really kind of nothing. Because if a car still has to be X amount, or it's really comes back to CAFE standards, and it says the fleet of vehicles have to be X, environmentally friendly, X amount of pollution. So things like this can help get some credits that can be distributed elsewhere, so that your entire fleet of cars is still under this nice little baseline that the EPA sets using those CAFE standards. So if you do something like this, they're going to have to figure out a different way unless you change those standards. So I imagine if this is either a nothing, or this is either kind of the lead into a huge change on CAFE standards. And now the whole credit system is stupid. The fact that you can sell a hybrid Trailblazer, but you have to sell a bunch of them so that you can then turn around and sell a diesel 2500, or things like how the Mustang Mach-E shares the name with the Mustang, and how all that kind of unfolds. Just stupid things like that make these the carbon credits so dumb. Or the fact that you could sell them to other people. Like, for a long time, Tesla was selling carbon credits so that Dodge could make the Hellcat stuff. Like, they were trading it like it was some commodity of how much emissions you can release. It's just dumb. It's a weird, stupid thing that makes the competition in the car market just a mess, instead of just opening the gates and saying, hey, figure it out. Now, to end this all off, I often get a lot of people saying, you know, Cooper, you're always talking bad about this kind of stuff. Like, these are good things that are happening. Why don't you talk bad about things that happened before or other people did? Why do you only talk bad about these things? Few reasons. I find the people that you support, like, you know, I support Lee Zeldin and these type of people more than the previous administration. Not fully, but more. If you supported and voted for people like this, I voted for this administration, you should be extremely critical of everything you don't like. Because there's no reason to be critical of the people you don't support. You already don't support them. It's known. You have to be critical of the people that you voted for because that's your guy. That's your team. And when I hear politicians, which I already don't trust, saying things that I want to hear, that's when I also distrust them more. Because they're just saying things that they know I want to hear as their voter base. Which makes me skeptical because I don't trust any politician. None. Across the board. Just zero. Even though Lee Zeldin was my local one in New York for a long time. I actually got to meet him on a field trip. We got to, you know, sit there on Capitol Hill as Lee Zeldin kind of preached to us. It's kind of interesting. But, again, you should be extremely critical of the people that you voted for because that's your stamp of approval. If you already didn't approve of someone, you don't really have to be critical of them. You can give them their flowers if they do something good, and they all do. Like, there's no administration that you can't point to that did nothing good. There's no administration that you can point to that did nothing bad. But you got to give people their due when they do it, and you got to be distrusting of the people that you put in power. So, now, that was to end it off, but I'm going to say a lot of this cafe standard stuff doesn't really matter because, unfortunately, CARB, the California sector of the EPA, where they make their own car laws, still has so much power because they have such a huge market share, and as states pick up using the CARB regulations and standards, they just end up falling into this, like, trap of, you know, I think it's already like 30% of all cars are sold under CARB regulations. So as that grows, as they add like Colorado, New York, Arizona, and they just start to, you know, seep into the ground with their tentacles, that's going to grow, and what the EPA says doesn't matter because CARB is going to have more say. So if your state is trying to pick up CARB standards, you should fight that tooth and nail because it's going to be the absolute death of just the overall car industry. I know there's already some talk about the administration currently fighting back against CARB, but until that happens, it needs to be fought at the local level, and you should push against CARB at every chance you get. But that is it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Follow, like, subscribe, and I can keep making more videos like this, but I will see you next time.